Hi, this is Mr. Smith, and this is day 4, the final day of the 5th unit of government. We have a short week next week, so we'll start the next unit, Unit 6, tomorrow on Friday. So today in the chat, you can type for the bell ringer, what do you know about trial systems? And that was based on the notes from yesterday, or even if you just watched TV shows like Law & Order, you can probably answer that question. And the first thing that we'll do today is complete the Government 5 PA judicial activity, which is, go to the modules here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 down. If you click on that, you can see there's an EI chart. So if you click on that, it should offer to open you up a copy. And it looks something like this. There are 3 columns. On the first column would be the different types of courts. And then in this column, you need to type 3 pieces of evidence or facts about each of these types of courts. And then over here, 1 interpretation about each. And you can see the video is right here. So you can just click on that. And it gives you a little bit of an overview showing that the judicial pyramid of the different parts. You don't have to write everything down right then, because as it goes through, it will introduce judges from each of the different parts of the court system that goes along with each of these parts of the table. But the notes for the unit. We are going to finish the notes by talking about crimes and sources of law. First of all, there's both criminal law and civil law that comes before the court. So let's look at crimes first. Crime, of course, is when you violate the law or ignore the law that has been established by the state legislature. It is, of course, punishable. There are consequences. Misdemeanors are minor crimes punishable by a fine or short prison term, while a felony is a more serious crime that can result in prison for more than a year or perhaps the death penalty in some states, like Pennsylvania currently has. The other thing to remember, though, is if people plead guilty and avoid a courtroom trial, the prosecutor might reward them by offering a suspended sentence, maybe a year in prison, but they knock off 4 months or something like that. So it is possible for these to be a little bit different. And then the next one would be civil law, or suing people. And lawsuits often involve your responsibility through others. For instance, if just compensation is due, or perhaps you signed a contract where a buyer doesn't pay or a seller does not provide the good or service. It can involve negligence when someone has suffered because of the harm caused to another person. It could be if you say something that is malicious and knowingly harmful to someone else. If it's spoken, it's slander. If it's written, it's libel. By the way, there's a higher barrier for celebrities and public officials. They basically, because of their fame, have accepted the fact that there will be things said about them, and it has to do with freedom of speech in that case because they're public figures. It's also important to remember this involves civil law. So you might say, well, don't I have freedom of speech to even tell lies? You do, but that's why we can't have criminal laws against people saying what they want to. But someone could still sue you for causing them harm. Also, titles to land. The government does have the ability to claim eminent domain and seize property that must be paid for, so you can sue them and take them to court if you don't agree with the amount. And then also family matters, events involving, for instance, children, child custody, alimony, divorce, those kinds of things. And then there are also the sources of law. We get our main source of law from the Constitution. It is the supreme law of the land according to Article 6. Statutory law are laws passed by the legislative branch. So each of the laws passed by the legislature is a statutory law. Case law is when a previous court case sets a precedent or tradition for others to follow. You might have noticed in courtroom drama or TV shows or movies, for instance, they often refer to a previous case. They might be arguing in front of the jury or talking to the judge, and they said, but in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, so they'll refer to an earlier case, and that's because they don't have to re-explain or re-decide every single decision. They just want to refer back to earlier ones. Common law is a little bit more difficult to enforce, unlike in the past. It involves cultural traits and accepted behavior. And then administrative law. Sometimes legislatures pass laws like keep the air clean, but they don't provide enough detail. So the agency in charge of it, like the Environmental Protection Agency or EPA, then has to make up rules in order to do that. So that would be an example of administrative law. And then there's civil rights and liberties, and we already talked about this before. But civil rights are positive acts the government protects, like our right to speak and worship and defend ourselves. But it also, for instance, involves equal rights for everyone, like the 14th Amendment. It says that all these rights apply to everybody, no matter where they are, no matter what state they're in, and the only due process, the criminal justice system, can take away these rights from us. And we have tried to make this more prevalent. Obviously, segregation was taking away people's civil rights. And so eventually de jure or lawful segregation was ruled unconstitutional. We've tried to correct that through programs like affirmative action, which awards extra points to people that might have suffered through some type of prejudice. But of course, something you might hear of that companies might try to do is make sure that a certain percentage of their employees are female or African American or so on. Those are called quotas, and those are actually illegal. Rights apply to you whether you are born here or whether you become a citizen. So if you were born here, that's known as jus soli, or part of the soil, or jus sanguinis, which is of the blood. So either of those apply to you. And then liberties are protections against government acts. So, for instance, the Fourth Amendment says the government can't disperse your home. They must have probable cause or a warrant. They can't use cruel and unusual punishment. But it also applies to some of these other ones from earlier. Freedom of speech, our right to speak, is a civil right. The government can't stop it from happening. So the government being restricted is the example of a civil liberty. And then the last one here would be punishments. Punishments happen, of course, after a person is convicted or the jury decides that they're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But some of the punishment can actually happen earlier. For instance, when someone is arraigned and is awaiting the trial to happen, should they be released? Are they dangerous? Perhaps they're a flight risk. Maybe if they're released, people are worried they'll run away. So if that happens, they have to set aside a certain amount of money. That's known as bail. Now, some people say that's unfair because it's more burdensome to the poor, for instance, and it's also a form of punishment that happens before you've been convicted. Rehabilitation versus punishment. The question is, should we put more effort into rehabilitating prisoners or into punishing them? Rehabilitation allows them to become reformed so they become better citizens when they get out of prison. Punishment, of course, is to provide some type of harsh confinement to deter others from committing the crime, and it also means there are consequences. The United States focuses more on punishment. Other countries like Sweden or Norway focus on rehabilitation. There is a less chance that criminals will return to crime in countries that use rehabilitation. There's a greater chance they'll return to crime when punishment is used. Probation is the part of the initial sentence that goes into effect, and parole is what happens when they're getting to leave the last of their sentence. So the release activities, including having a parole officer that you have to check in with, and you have to go to work, and you have to have a registered place to live. Restoration of rights is something else that's debatable. Should people who are released from prison, especially if they were felons committing a serious crime, should they get back all of their rights? Should they be allowed to vote? And of course, that is different from state to state. But for the remainder of the period, since this is the end of the unit, don't forget to take the Government 5 quizzes. Remember, you can take those up to 2 times each. Tomorrow, we will start unit number 6.